Hello, everyone. This is Tripp, and I'm here with Diana Butler Bass, and we're ready. We're ready
Yeah, we're ready.
to ruin your lunch or morning coffee or whatever it is, because it's ruining dinner.
I was thinking about how we named this. We started it when you were in Edinburgh. And so the only time we could do it that worked for your schedule when you were there was like 5 o'clock here on the East Coast of the United States. And so that was like dinner time. And it was nighttime for you. And so now that you're back here, you live in North Carolina now. Um, we're just usually ruining lunch.
I know. The uh, I basically try to organize things so when I finish drop offs around 9:30, I start
Right.
working, and then the first round of kids show up at 2:45, and then the oldest gets out at 4:20. So it's kind of dangerous to be using streaming internet when once elementary school children are in the house with their friends, and then wait till they go to bed. In
Yeah,
Scotland, it
that's
was great because they go
absolutely
to bed
true.
at 9 or 10 o'clock there when I'm normally up just reading. All these Americans are like, "Sure, I'll Zoom with you." Like it's just a normal time trip. You used to ask me to Zoom at night, and
Yep.
now I'm back to trying to lure academics to hang out until past my kids go to bed to talk to me on the internet, and they're like, "But we used to do it at 3:30." I'm like, "Yeah, well, yeah."
But you're thinking, "I was up until 1 or 2 in the morning talking to you."
Yes. Yes.
But that's, we don't wanna do too much chatting because, oh my gosh,
What,
I
Diana? Has anything been going on?
you know, I keep saying, "Oh, I'm just wanna ignore the news."
Good luck. Good
You
luck.
can't walk out your door without it, like, hitting you in the face as a flood.
Mhm.
I mean, it's just an extraordinary, uh, number of really interesting stories in the news, and almost all of them have something to do with faith, theology, religion, sort of ethics, spirituality. There is always, right now, it seems like a religion dimension to all these stories.
Including exciting new religion dimension. One of my favorite American church historians, public theologian extraordinaire, turned 65.
Oh,
Did you
yes,
know
I
that?
did.
Diana Butler Bass did.
I
Woo!
did. So after I get off of our Zoom today, I have to put in my call to Medicare because you can do it 3 months before your birthday, up to 3 months after your birthday. And I've just been in denial. So I now have to do it. I can't be in denial anymore. And also the fact that it looks like we might have a government shutdown in just a few days.
Oh,
And
just
so I don't want to be sitting around, because if the Republicans actually do shut down the government, it could last 3 months and I could miss being on Medicare. And so I thought, oh, geez, you know, if we think the news isn't important, sometimes the news just really is the most important thing on your desk. So, Mike
yeah.
Johnson, thanks, Mike.
Oh, yeah. Well, he keeps it classy. He keeps it classy. He's just trying to model quality Orthodox biblical Christianity to the people.
Uh,
That a good old speaker Mike.
One of the things that I don't know, it's just really interesting. You hear lots of stuff in the air, Washington, D.C. About 80% of it is rumors, and some of it is true. But there does seem to be some level of Republicans right now saying that Mike Johnson isn't up for the job. And my first thought was when I started hearing this little scuttlebutt in the background, but wait a minute, isn't this the guy who said that God appointed him to do this, that he
Yeah.
was the man for the hour? So apparently God is falling down on the
Well,
job.
maybe it's like where Saul was the first king, and God's like, well, it didn't work out with Saul. I'll try again. I'll try again. And just because they were anointed by God doesn't mean they couldn't turn out to be a giant failure.
Yeah, it to me, it's really interesting, to watch him because he there have been increasing numbers of people in important positions in the government who are outright, you know, Christian Reconstructionists, theocratic evangelicals, dominionists, all this sort of thing. And we could make the case that Mike Pence was of that ilk, and I have made that case on different occasions. But Mike Pence played his cards theologically really close to his vest. And I think that the best way to describe Mike Pence was through his involvement with the family, which was not the family is a lot of different things, as Jeff Charlotte has written in his books, earlier books. But one of the things that it isn't is it's not really very dogmatic. And so you could kind of be influenced by Christian Reconstruction. You could kind of be influenced by Dominionism. You could kind of be influenced by sort of theocratic Catholic, neo Christendom stuff. But the family's always a little squishy. It's just about Jesus, you know? And so Mike Pence was really more of that ilk. We never knew where Mike Pence went to church. Nobody seems to know like where he goes to church in Indiana. It's like he keeps all those things really secretive. But so we never had clarity on what his theological positions were when he was vice president. We just sort of could guess because of his associations in the past and some things like that. But Mike Johnson, he's a whole different character. He's the third most powerful person in the United States government, and he is Christian Reconstructionist. I mean, or at least a Seven Mountains guy. He is just full on there. You can look up his church in Louisiana. It's a Baptist church, and it's one of those really big, sort of Baptist mega churches in the South. And the sermons are, Christian America and patriotic stuff, and all the apocalyptic. I mean, it's just really kind of classic. Evangelical Christian America, heavy dose of Christian Reconstruction stuff, and you see it all the time with him. And so I think it's really interesting to watch him. It says like he really does believe that God has put him there. He really does believe in all this stuff. He really has very, very strong theological opinions. They show up when he's not like in front of the cameras. There was a event at the Bible Museum a few weeks ago where he said all kinds of really worrisome things about the future of America and democracy, and so that stuff happens at those kinds of events. But he's been very, kind of just powerless to wrestle the beast of Congress in any one direction, and he seems to be, controlled by whoever has the biggest mouth microphone, pushes them around the hardest. And right now that appears to be the Donald Trump, Marjorie Taylor Greene element of the Republican Party. So this is all really kind of wild.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean to go off on him, but it's really important to keep an eye on Mike Johnson. And, one of the things that just slays me all the time when I'm watching the news is people say, well, the president met with Mike Johnson today, or Chuck Schumer met with Mike Johnson today to try to come to a compromise on the budget or the government shutdown or what have you. And my first thought in every one of those cases is those people have never set foot in an evangelical church, because compromise is what you don't do. It's like if you compromise, you're a member of the Church of Laodicea in the book of Revelation.
Watch out.
Yeah, I know. You're squishy. You're going to be sent into
Ooh.
fire. This is exactly what you cannot do. Compromise is a really, 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 as you know, Tripp, bad word in evangelical circles. So the media sits back there with their sort of very secular or whatever, completely a-religious frameworks. And they try to treat him like he's Kevin McCarthy, who didn't have a religious bone in his body, who was all about power and manipulation, and Kevin McCarthy were the things that he was about. But Mike Johnson is a true believer, and he functions like one. Means he's a little inept about government and how to use power, but he likes it. And he also there's just certain things that are not gonna happen, and compromise is one of them.
Mhm.
It would compromise his salvation if he compromised. He's not gonna do that.
Yeah. You know, that actually this isn't on our agenda, except that, one of the things I've been working a lot on is something for much later in the year with Jeff Pugh, theologian, Bonhoeffer scholar. We're
Mhm.
working on this project around, using the story of Bonhoeffer to tell the changing relationship of the church and state in the rise of Nazi
Ooh.
Germany. And so it's led to reading all sorts of things, including there's some really cool collections of like right after the fact where people put together all these documents of church leaders in Germany discussing what to do and at what point, and then as they start to make a series of changes within the church, and then within the confessing church, where people kind of realize they're on a ride, and the percentage, like as people kind of broke off or tried to disengage, the percentage of true believers driving the church decision making process, the ordination process, education, these kind of things within the church, as you got more true believers in kind of the Nazi vision, the opportunity to work from within for some kind of like semblance. Like, think of the kind of stuff you hear from people in the last Trump administration who write a book. They're like, well, if I wasn't in the room, I wouldn't have stole the attack on Iran military plan off Trump's desk. And you're like, well, how did it get there? And why did you wait to monetize this story? Right. And then it comes out and no one is even losing biscuits about it, because like as the percentage of true believers stay, then the logic that you're trying to accommodate to gets more intense. And reading
Mm.
these letters and, correspondence or narratives from diaries of after meeting, right, certain people's, written narratives after of church leaders, it sounds so familiar to the kind of wrestling you hear, at least I hear when I've talked to church leaders, denomination leaders, in the midst of the whole cultural shift since 2016, where
Right.
there's this like you have like the people in your pews, you have politics upstream of religion now, and then this fear like, oh, how do we do a purple church, how do we not alienate but make these statements, that like getting the kind of critical distance you get to read it historically creeps me out more about the present. And and it'll all get tamed into a long narrative that Jeff and I are working on. But just reading it, it it sounds like the emails I get from ministers and denomination leaders, or when I'm like, with them and talking, and they're like, well, how do we negotiate this and such, where the fear driving people is, can I risk clarity about my convictions? And then at what point have are you like past the ability to justify remaining in a silent or compromised situation?
Yeah, one of the things that I think is really fascinating is that so many of the people who we work with are in mainline churches. And the national numbers for mainline churches are fairly evenly divided. I think that 52% of mainliners voted for Trump and 48 white ones. White mainliners voted for Trump and 48% voted against him. It was a fairly even kind of number. And that number has not been paid as close attention to because of the evangelical number. So you have this really, huge percentage of white evangelicals, somewhere between 78 and 82%, depending what poll you're looking at. And that drives all the attention. But what gets a lot less attention is this very divided number, and white Catholic churches are like this too. And so what we clearly have is something that is, it's racially influenced or class influenced around the class status of most American whites who would go to church, which are going to be mostly working middle and upper middle class, not necessarily super rich and not really super poor. And so you have a problem around white people. And the problem around with the mainliners is that they're not really discussing this in any significant way. They're just sort of giving themselves, I think. I mean, this is me. This is my people. So I'm talking here out of being in these pews, working with these folks, knowing this tradition inside and out the way I do. I think we have given ourselves a little bit of a pass, because we say, "Oh, well, we're not as bad as the white evangelicals." And so, what I'm trying to do here is hold this group together. Most likely, your congregation isn't terribly divided. Because congregations are different than national numbers. It's going to be pretty rare that you go into a mainline, some ELCA church, and it's going to be 50-50 Republicans and Democrats. It's going to swing, one way or another with some level of majority.
Well, and you and I get invited to the ones that are like 80-20. And then, but when we're coming, they let you know about the 3 people on the right who are really upset that you're coming and will
Oh my
likely try to
gosh.
derail your session,
Yes.
which I found like even so. A couple weeks ago, I was speaking at a lecture series at a church, and I was talking about like process metaphysics, and like because they one of the sessions on process theology. How in the world that got turned into a question where I'm supposed to talk about Donald Trump, and I'm like, well, I have strong opinions about this, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure this is what everyone is here for, but I'm more than happy to talk after. And then after, half the people basically stayed for me to talk to whoever the right wing guy at their church is.
Really? That's so funny. I mean, I get that too. People will say very clearly to me, don't talk about Donald Trump. And usually it's because there are 2 or 3 or 4 people in a congregation of 2 or 3 or 400 people who will make just such a stink. So there's a couple of things that I do in those situations. I don't know how you handle them besides doing the after chat. Um, one is that, I'm just myself. And if people don't like that, they're free. There's the door, they're really free to go somewhere else for the next couple of hours because I'm not going to be there very long. But one of my theories of the internet, and I've learned this from other people who are very good with the internet, is if you pay attention primarily to the people who are cruel to you or you disagree with on the internet, and you ignore the people who are the neat people who are there, the ones who want to engage in a real conversation or who are smart or kind and all that sort of stuff, what you're actually doing is you're rewarding the bad people. And so I think that one of the things right now mainline churches are doing is rewarding the bad people. They're rewarding the troublemakers by trying to please the troublemakers all the time and trying to answer the troublemakers' questions all the time. What they're doing is leaving out this huge percentage of people who are really happy, who want to discuss, these hard things and who don't know how to, and so where we put our attention is really significant on the kind of communities that we're building.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that I just do. When I'm there and somebody asks me a question like that, I will actually come up with an answer that's pretty oftentimes kind of brutal because I do not want to reward that person for their question. I'll
Mm-hmm.
say something like, that question is irrelevant, or, I'm glad you're trying to disrupt this session. I mean, I'll actually call it out. I said, but actually, these people want to talk about these things over here. And I can talk about this, but you will not like a single thing that I say. And I'm not changing my mind. And so
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just like that's the kind of clarity that we actually need, I think, from leaders and I can't tell people how to behave in their own churches. They know their own congregations better than, sort of I do ever as a guest. But at the same time, the system rewards silence and cowardice. And that's actually the point that I wanted to make because it goes back to your Bonhoeffer point, is that if that you have a system that is saying, "Oh, no, let's see if we can all get along and we can change it from the inside, and, it's gonna be fine in the longer run. This is just a blip." which is exactly what those ministers were saying in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s. You just keep going with that.
And in civil rights time in America, you would, right? Like that's part of what the origin of the letter from the Birmingham jail by MLK is.
Oh, right. Of course.
Right. That same kind of logic.
Right. Right. It's that. And what that is, I am not convinced, that liberal churches in America failed because they talked about the civil rights movement or they talked about Vietnam. I'm convinced they failed because they didn't. And, it just, under the guise of pastoral direction, we have often let really truly reprehensible views and harmful things completely against the teachings of Jesus take a pass. And that's just really, and it's not everybody. I mean, I know tons and tons of brave mainline clergy and theologians, but those people are in the minority in these denominations. I mean, I think we just had to be honest with this. And it's really hard because, your living is depending upon it. And the way that livings in the United States are dependent upon, your health insurance are dependent upon where
if
you
your
work.
retirement and health insurance are attached to your vocational status.
I know. It's crooked. I mean, it's a systemic problem that actually undermines the gospel. And that the denominations themselves feed into that. And so, because the denominations are not standing up and the denominations aren't creating separate structures for these kinds of things that are free from congregational interference, then it just becomes a self-replicating problem. And so what I think that, all this is just sort of the upside of saying is that the mainline, the people we think, oh, well, they kind of do the right thing and they're so liberal and blah, 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 blah. No, we have a problem here. And we have it inside of our own institutions. So unlike the evangelicals who ran the problem off, where all the people who are dissenters had to leave, we do have considerable number of dissenters within the institution, but the dissenters at this point are wrong. I mean, the people who are voting for well, I mean, the dissenters, I don't know if that's us or them because it's 50-50 on a national level, but it's like there is no planet in which Donald Trump is in any way, shape, or form a fit human being to be the president of the United States. And there is no place in the history of Christianity, well, there is in the history of Christianity, but should be in the history, not in the present, where Christianity is used as a tool of violent oppression and limiting the human rights of other people. Never, never, never again. That's that's what should be on all of our walls. Just, Nick Vietor, never again.
Yeah.
None of this. And so that we can't stand up and say that at this moment, it's just appalling. People come to this thing, I know, because they know this. And they feel crazy, in their own settings. And there are days when I just kind of, I don't know what to do anymore. It's like, I was in a church like that too, in the not too distant past, where I was told, not to talk about these things. And it came up naturally. And so I said, no, look, I was told not to talk about this, but truth is, I cannot stand here and say nothing.
Do you think part of that tension that's so difficult with mainline Protestants is, you mentioned the data where there's it's very parallel numbers when it goes to how the congregants vote. But if you were to talk to their clergy, that's not the case, right? So I was one of the mainline denominations, a regional gathering or at the beginning of the year, and there were more clergy in the room who were like anti-Biden for left reasons than there were ones that would consider voting for a Republican. But if you ask them, ooh, I did this bit where it's like, well, which of the major political figures resonates most deeply with your like values and such? You get one skewing, and then go like, what's the center of your congregation? And you just see a
Oh,
march of
yeah.
clergy to the right, further right of the room, right? And so and then I asked like, well, what's the birth of that gap, right? And I think that's kind of a place that's different than in evangelical ones for thinking theologically. Part of it, is probably related to how poorly we do on education. Also, like when you grew up in a context where you're previously the religion at the center of American culture and such, that leads to a different kind of especially for white mainline Protestants, a different kind of, in scare quotes, muted prophetic voice than if you're right in the black church at the same time, or these kind of things. So, and to me, that I don't know, I don't know if we've taken seriously what generates that gap, and then how are we supposed to think about it ecclesiologically when we think about the task of the church and our own identity, because most of the books and most of the initial responses, especially the ones that come out of the mouths of denominational leaders, assumes this is a problem to solve as part of our survival narrative, right? Like
Correct.
it's part of like, how do we keep our congregation alive, our denomination alive? And that involves like coming up with something to explain to clergy with convictions that cultivating ambiguity around important issues is essential for keeping a purple church of some type.
Right. Right. And that's what the vision is this idea of a purple church. And I use that image in one of my earlier books, and I actually think it was a helpful image given the context of when that book was written, immediately following 9/11, in the context of the Bush administration, but that was a whole different kind of cluster of political, social, theological problems than what we have now 20 years later. And so if I were to go back and rewrite that, I'd write it differently. But see, the issue of survival, and that's one of the things I think too, you know, is that there is nothing that is occupying the offices of our denominations more than churches closing, the plate shrinking. How are we going to maintain these institutions? People are very worried about the pension funds, all of these things. Also empty pulpits. I mean, that's become a huge problem. I know several bishops who live in dioceses that are places that are maybe not the easiest places for some very liberal clergy member to live, but what that means is that they've got 15 or 20 parishes that have no minister. And so that's really problematic. So there was all these questions of survival. And that's actually when I was doing this one event where I was told, you shouldn't really bring up anything about Donald Trump. It just focus on the future of the church, focus on trends. But actually, one of the trends brings us face to face with MAGA and Donald Trump. And that is young adults, the very people that everybody wants in their church. Young adults want to talk about politics.
Or clarity about it, right?
Yeah,
This is I
right.
think that's the part that struck me out. So at the denominational gathering, I can't remember if I told you this story, if I told you while we were recording or not, but they had someone get up there and present. They had tracked IP addresses visiting their diocese church websites for the first time, right? So that, theoretically, these would be people that moved into the area and are looking at churches, or the first time they go to check on a church. The most visited part immediately on the church website is trying to find out what the church thinks about very specific issues like LGBTQ inclusion or rejection, like same-sex marriage type things, environment stuff. Like when you think of the things that mainline Protestants that are moderating themselves into irrelevancy avoid, those are the topics potential first-time visitors in the area are going to look for when it goes to their website. Second is the click outs from staff bio pages. So they're going to go check what the staff's like Instagram is. It's like, what do they care about? Are they within my age range? Right. A
Oh,
first
yeah,
time
good question.
visitor, you're much more likely to visit a church where one of the full-time staff members is within 10 years your age. Right. So like, one, are they the age? Do they have family or not? Like, do you have a single adult on staff? Because that's the largest number of unchurched adult people. People that desire some religious community and don't have one are single adults. Because what do churches love? Married people and their children. And so, like, when you just like look at that, like they were presenting this as to how to do your websites good, that kind of thing, and I'm just like, well,
That's a gold
I
mine
was
of
just like, just to
information.
clarify, those are the questions y'all are all telling me we can't be clear about.
Right.
And people are saying, like, will there be people my age there in my life situation? And if I leave my kids alone with you, which was the third one, like safe church policies or like info on church curriculum. If you have a kid, you're like, what are you telling them? Are they going to be told their moms are going to hell, or they have to get washed in the blood and they're a filthy sinner? Or are you going to tell them X, Y, and Z? Right. And it's even true, right, about people that are much more conservative. They want to know answers to these questions. We
Right.
might wish the world was different and and things, but since it's not, like, it seems to me there's like a clarity, right? Like people are wanting a kind of clarity about the convictions in about the conversations as a people in this country we're having, and that kind of mainline vapid moderatism is like, well, how can we say we're open and welcoming everyone without naming any specific issues that might be challenging?
I know, it
How
just
can we
makes
say
no
we care
sense.
about the planet, but not say anything that's part of the Chinese hoax agenda and climate change? How can we do, yeah, and
Right.
and so that's just sitting there. And I found it was like, I wish they had presented this before I talked, and I would have just asked
Gone for
to
it.
steal the slides and gone, this is a good one. Yeah.
I literally have said to several groups in recent months, I said, "If you have anywhere on your website, or if you say it to someone's face when they come and visit your church, we don't engage in politics here." You know what you've done? You've just hung out a huge sign that says no one under 40 is welcome in this congregation. I mean, because that is just it's not that young adults and you're 40. I mean, I'm smart enough to know this because I have a 26-year-old daughter and I hang around with people who are a lot younger than me. But it's like, no, that you don't wanna just sit around and say, "Hey, have you been to the local Democratic Party meeting?" That's not what I mean by talking about politics. It's what you mean by talking about politics, and that is helping people think through serious moral and social issues, given frameworks of meaning that are related to depth and tradition and ancient scriptures and wisdom and it's like that's what we mean when you have an entire generation of people who want to talk about politics. Two generations now. You have millennial, the end of Gen X, millennials, and now all of Gen Z. And politics is their most important concern. And you put up a sign that says, "Oh, we never talk about politics here." And so why are you ask? And then you ask, why aren't they coming to your church? It's because you're not engaging, creating an environment that helps them struggle with and through the issues that are most pressing to their lives. And they don't want to talk about politics the way that you talked about politics. They want to talk about politics the way that it needs to be talked about
Yeah.
today. And and
Well, and
and
that, I think
ugh,
that
makes me
generational shift,
crazy.
like the important thing mainliners may not recognize, especially the ones in leadership who have self-selected to enjoy mainline Protestantism as it is,
That is
and
exactly right.
skew older. Um, that millennials and younger are the people that came of age 9/11 and later. So just like if you think of the institutional crises that our culture, politics, economics, and such have had since then, like who have been the leaders with that rose and fell, and all that kind of stuff. You just like if that's been your life experience, the intuitions of people who were formed uh, coming out of World War II and going through the 60s and being the denominations that ended up, kind of like internalizing the learnings from it in a more life-giving way of sorts, then like you have a very different relationship to culture, institutions, economics, and religion. The those at 9/11 and after the they it's just the I don't know, like that psychographic group has an inherent suspicion to authority structures because of what's actually happened, right? It's like they don't have a nostalgic referent of when democracy thrived and solved problems. It's just not it's not a memory space that exists.
Right.
And so we don't talk about it, which in the past could have been committed to, like, as denominations, we're invested in like lobbying for this, and we've made this social change, and it's on the margins of what we're doing, but we're a part of kind of the growing inclusion of democracy and recognizing equal rights and supporting a vibrant democracy and all that. So we like don't get into it right here. Well, now if you say we don't get
We
into
have
it
an
right here,
office to do that in Washington, D.C.
yeah,
So you can give them money
yeah.
directly or get on their mailing list. That's the idea of politics that's functioning in these denominations, and it's really bad.
So okay, so one of the things we put on our list we wanted to
Okay.
talk about.
And this is actually all wrapped into the things that are on our list,
I know
I think.
one of them was the South Carolina results, and now you didn't say specific what about it, but I wrote down the numbers on white evangelicals and everyone else that voted in the Republican primary,
Oh, good.
because white evangelicals, 75% of them in South Carolina voted for Donald Trump,
Of course they did.
and 25% for Haley. So let's imagine you're a Republican and not a white evangelical. Donald Trump got 49% and Haley got 51%. Well, there's that. You know,
Yep.
it's actual returns, and
There are so many white evangelicals right now who don't like Donald Trump and don't like Christian nationalism, but they don't want to talk about these statistics because one of the things that they're trying to, I think, excuse for or kind of cover up, or I don't know what they're trying to do with why they're trying to do it, is there's actually a refusal to admit that there is some sort of deep-seated theological, historical set of questions within evangelicalism in white communities that have actually led to this. That these two that Trump is some sort of logical development out of their tradition. And they actually refuse to admit it. I was watching the Principles First thing. There was this, which are basically never Trump Republicans. And they had a conference here in Washington, D.C. a few days ago. And there's a lot of bulwark people who are involved in it. But it's not a bulwark thing. It's just like they're kind of there. But there's a bunch of other kinds of people there too who are never Trump Republicans. And they had a panel on religion. It was literally one of the worst things I have ever seen on television, and I'm glad it was on C-SPAN because nobody was watching it except for me. So, it was all basically white evangelicals except for Mona Charen, who's Jewish, I guess. And I've met her and I've talked to her, and she doesn't actually even know when we've talked. She asked me who she should talk to regarding Christianity and politics, in addition to David French. And I gave her a list of names. She was not in charge of the panel. She was just on the panel. Um, and so, I give Jewish conservatives a big pass on knowing who to put on a panel like this. But the other people all were evangelicals or had evangelical backgrounds. And they said things like, um, don't call it Christian nationalism because it's not Christian. And it got big cheers from the audience. And I'm looking at this and going, what are we trying to do here? Are you trying to whitewash the fact that this stuff is literally from your tradition? 75% of white evangelicals just voted for Donald Trump in South Carolina. And so the, one of the problems with the white evangelical critique of white evangelical or white Christian nationalism is that there's this deep apologetic thread in it, and it's not telling the whole truth. And while some of those people risk a lot and are saying a lot of really important things, I keep asking myself, you know, what's well, I know why it is. They're trying to rehabilitate their own theological tradition. And I understand that because this must hurt. I mean, it hurts me when I have to criticize my people. But I don't feel the need to rehabilitate white mainline Protestantism. What I feel the need to do is to help it be different, to take it to a different place, to say, hey guys, we blew this, we can do self-critique. And that gets us to a different location in the future. We can do better. But evangelicals don't think that way. At least white ones don't. And right now, so much of the stuff that's criticizing exactly what you're saying is not really critique. It's kind of a cover up. And there's an awful lot of narrative coming out from pollsters who have ties with evangelicalism in one way, shape, or form, or seem to have evangelical agendas at some level, is that they're saying, oh, these people don't go to church. So they're really not evangelicals. They're not hearing the true message of Jesus. They just call themselves evangelicals when they're asked by a survey
Yeah.
taker.
Well, if you're doing such great marketing for your brand that non-church attending nationalists are like, yeah, that's the team I'm on, then that's so
That's the team I'm on.
they're like, are you an evangelical? Oh yeah, I love Donald Trump. And they're like, well, what
I
about
know.
Jesus? Exactly. I see
Same
them dots.
guy.
I saw that meme where Jesus came and talked to Trump right after he wrote the Constitution. That one.
Mhm.
So, okay.
But that's really interesting, that South Carolina number.
Oh yeah, it's kind of like you're sitting there going, oh, well, that was honest. Like all the way to the point that if you're just not a white evangelical, Haley won. Like, not that I would think. I mean, I'm so far not a Republican. I'm not sure what to think about that, but it is very different. Like she theoretically, after working for him, decided she liked democracy. So there's that. But
well, apparently there was this moment in, I guess, the RNC, that Rona Romney, whatever her last name was or is, who was in charge of the Republican National Committee, who was just a toady, absolute, just terrible when it came to criticizing Trump. She just echoed everything he said. And of course, he now has thrown her under the bus. And so she had to she resigned being the chair of the RNC, just I think it was yesterday or the day before. And they're holding their meeting and they're trying to figure out who's the new chair. And apparently there's some incredible pro MAGA guy who's going to take it over. And his co-chair is going to be Laura Trump, Donald Trump's daughter-in-law, who's going to be taking all the money that every Republican across the country donates to the RNC and putting it in Donald Trump's legal funds.
well, yeah,
So, I mean,
that's how it works.
Just a little grift.
Hey,
but
Diana, it started raining and I have a dog stuck outside.
Oh no.
I'm gonna go get them in, but why don't you set up the IVF thing while I go rescue Wicket? Because
oh, okay. Go ahead. Go get your dogs out of the rain. Hey, everybody, guess what? This is Diana's Politics and Religion show now. But to finish that thought, even though Tripp isn't here to sort of bounce off, I was really sort of shocked because it's not just about the grift of Laura Trump, but we were talking, Tripp and I were just talking very specifically about the influence of these really important sort of waves of theology and history that are within white Christian nationalism through the evangelical community. And so the RNC meets, they're talking about their new leadership. And apparently Laura Trump floated the idea at this RNC meeting that she asked, should a woman be the next vice president? Should a woman be on my father-in-law's ticket? And she was booed. And people interpreted that as, oh, well, there you are. People interpreted the booing at the RNC as folks not liking the idea of picking a vice presidential candidate on the basis of gender or some other politically correct thing. But I didn't. I know that room is full of white evangelicals. And if you float the idea of a woman being vice president, they're not going to go there. They're going to want specifically not to have a woman be vice president, because I think that's the piece that's operative in this Nikki Haley thing, is that in part, they're not going to vote for Nikki Haley because they don't want women in leadership. They don't want women to vote. Why do they want women in leadership? And so they don't want women in leadership. They don't trust women. They don't think women have the right bodies, the right minds, or anything else to be president or even vice president of the United States. And Nikki Haley has the complicating factor, and this is why she could never win in a Republican Party, is that I don't know what her religion is now, but she grew up in a Hindu family. They're not going to vote for a brown woman who wasn't even raised as a Christian. And if she became a Christian at a later point, that's fine, but it doesn't get rid of all those other things, because they can just go and they can look at what her real name is, which is this beautiful Indian name, but she's not one of them. And she would always be suspect. So while that doesn't matter to more secular Republicans, the 51% or whatever that voted for her in the South Carolina primary, which is probably what she'd get if there were no evangelicals in the Republican Party, 75% of them didn't. And they didn't vote for her because of her religious background, because of her ethnic background, and because she's a female. And that is related very specifically to their ideas of hierarchy, to their ideas of power, and to their ideas about creation and men and women. And so those are theological ideas that are so deeply embedded in the community that they influence all of their political choices. And but see, people don't know. There's nobody in the media that can talk about that. And the people who can, like, the folks who were on that Principles First panel, they don't want to talk about that in public because they don't want to point out that they actually come from a tradition that teaches these things, and that these things about the status of women, these things about unbelievers, these things about world religions are things they learned too. And they might not personally accept those things anymore, but they know that that's the primary way people are taught in those communities.
Yeah. So
she's a Methodist now. Thank you very much.
Oh, her and Hillary.
I really appreciate that coming in from one of the people on the stream. Yeah, thank you. I knew that she had become a Christian of some sort, or her family had some conversion experience along the way. But that doesn't even matter. And besides that, Methodist, hey, evangelical looks at that and says, "What kind of thing is that?"
I know that's where Hillary Clinton teaches Sunday school. Come on.
That's right. John what? Evangelical revival when?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Details.
Just details. Hell, history is so messy.
So, you had mentioned the Supreme Court ruling around IVF.
Yeah, wait,
Um,
that's where we
a-
need to really go. What
and
do you think?
well, well, I once I heard about it, I thought Diana's has she already tweeted "I told you so" or not? That was
I did.
I was like, whoa, yep, already happened. Already
Yes,
happened.
I'm sorry. I should say I told you so less often.
Well, when you call it directly, it yeah. I've only made a few positive predictions, publicly. I like to remind them or whenever they happen. But
Well, it's okay. You're only 40.
yeah, yeah. I don't
Wait.
even what
You'll have a lot of time to get it right
the
or
one of the
wrong.
things that kind of uh like I saw the initial response, right? So where you get this ruling that's kind of you see the agenda around women's health rights, body autonomy, and these kinds of things kind of expanding that the overturning of Roe v. Wade had. Our friend Tim Whitaker that runs New Evangelicals sent me a podcast interview with the Supreme Court justice. Did you see this?
Mm-mm.
Okay, the guy that wrote the opinion was on a MAGA podcast not too long ago, where he
Oh.
straight up talks about how he's a faithful member of this committed to the Seven Mountain Mandate. He just
Oh.
says it like, and I was just like, well, even if you were, wouldn't you want to not say that part out loud, like just like on basic thing? And I say this because
Yeah.
one of the things I regularly run into, especially around this conversation with our peers in kind of like the academic study of religion and things, if you're not connected to the world of kind of, like authoritarian right religion, then you don't really know how big an impact and how powerful the Christian nationalist element is.
That's correct.
And it's always hard to gauge, and then you never know if it's that day where you feel like everything's exploding, you probably exaggerate its importance. On other days, you're trying to like keep an level head and you're talking yourself down and minimize it. But when you think of the consequence of just the number of judges that were pushed through in the last Trump administration, and then going like, well, what does that result in? Take the IVF declaration, right? That Trump's against. Like he's like, oh, I support IVF. You could see his PR machine working real quickly. He's like,
Right.
I mean, I used to give to Planned Parenthood. Um, but then for like people that have been put in those positions because of what he represents, claiming the Seven Mountain Mandate. Now, Dana in the chat asked what the Seven Mountain Mandate is.
I
So
knew someone
like,
would do that.
so
I
you
was thinking we needed
so
to do that.
yeah, you should connect those dots because I'm sure you're better at explaining this. But I was talking to Tim earlier and he sent me that, and I was like, oh, this is straight up creepy. Is this what Diana was thinking about? And IVF. So Trips assumes people know what the Seven Mountain Mandate is and IVF. We'll let the fact we have a historian and a female. You can explain both, Diana.
Oh, good. Well, several people jumped in. So what IVF is in vitro fertilization, which is, the kind of conception that happens through science, where couples that can't conceive naturally have embryos created from their own bodies, their own sperm and egg, usually in a lab, and then it's implanted back into the mother or a surrogate in order to be able to have children. And there is a huge number of children in America who are born that way. So that's what IVF is. IVF has been criticized very badly by the Vatican. It's the one Christian group that stood up against IVF very strongly is the Vatican, because what happens to the embryos, the products of conception that aren't chosen to be implanted, and so embryos might be you know, thrown away. Um, and so that if you believe that life begins at conception, as the Catholic Church teaches, and as now huge numbers of evangelicals believe, then those embryos are, as the Alabama ruling overturning in vitro fertilization said it outright, that embryos are babies. To which, I think to myself, wait a second. You can put an embryo in a freezer, but if you put your actual baby in a freezer, there's some difference between an embryo and a actual baby, the ones you change the diapers of and stuff like that. But, hey, it's just one
Though,
of those.
a few of them I go, I use the freezer for timeout when they use potty work.
Right, I put my kid in the freezer all the time.
I had to stop spanking them, so I had to come up with a new punishment that was biblical, and I just thought,
I don't put them in the freezer. I mean, it's insane. I mean, and it's like shows the lack of sophisticated ethical thinking on the part of these communities. And I'm sure the Catholic Church is much more sophisticated about it than the evangelical guy in Alabama who was the judge. But nevertheless, that's where this whole thing is. And this is a direct result of the overturning of Roe versus Wade and the fact that there are fetal personhood bills in many of the 50 states. If you pass a fetal personhood bill, what you're passing is a bill that says that life begins at conception and that any conceived life, however it ends, it has the possibility of being murder. So miscarriage could be murder, charged to a miscarriage that on the part of the mother. If it can be proved that the mother was not taking appropriate care of herself, she can go to jail for having a miscarriage, which has already happened in some states. And then IVF is now illegal in Alabama because of this. And so that's what IVF is, and that's the ethical controversy around it, that conservative these very conservative Christian groups have kind of gotten us into this mess by fetal personhood and by this idea of life beginning at conception, because it just doesn't, in the same way we think about what a full human life is and what the full human life is worth. So anyhow, that's, my opinion there, but, that's a discussion that churches need to be involved in. Now, to back up and say, well, what has the Christian nationalism got to do with that? And this is a very simple definition. You mentioned the 7 mountain mandate.
yeah,
And the judge who was the one who basically outlawed IVF in Alabama, he these are his views, the 7 mountain mandate. Excuse me. And he pointed specifically to Christianity as being the motivating factor for him making this decision. He said the people of Alabama are Christians, and the people of Alabama have the right to outlaw this reprehensible procedure which kills babies. And so that was the justification. That was the actual justification in the legal document. The Christian people of Alabama have the right to make this a law in their Christian state because they are the majority and this is their opinion. So what's behind his view is this thing called the 7 mountains mandate. And I'm not going to go through all 7 mountains, but this is Diana's 3-sentence definition of Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is the belief that America is a Christian nation and must be a Christian nation in order to be able to live up to its calling from God. That's sentence 1. Sentence 2, there are 3 distinctive traditions that have fed into contemporary Christian nationalism as expressed in the MAGA movement. I'm still in this one sentence. Those are 1, Christian Reconstruction, a tradition that comes out of a very fundamentalist form of Calvinism. 2, the 7 mountain mandate, the idea that there are 7 mountains of human culture all of which must be taken over by Christians in order to have a truly godly society. And that's believed by people who are mostly Pentecostals and some a lot of non-denominational evangelicals. And 3, theocratic Roman Catholics, like the Roman Catholics who are currently on the Supreme Court, who want to be able to create a new Christendom. And so that's my short definition. That's actually 2 sentences. They're very long sentences, but they're 2 sentences. The idea of a Christian America that encapsulates 3 traditions: Christian Reconstruction, the Seven Mountains Mandate, and theocratic Roman Catholicism.
Yeah, in the thing about the judge saying his commitment to the Seven Mountain Mandate, like underneath it is the assumption that we meaning the Christian nationalist group types, have leaders in these 7 spheres of influence in society, including
Right.
law, to do the right thing, right? To do the just and good thing, which is their kind of theocratic religious agenda. And so the shock to me, like you can get how like if you're a judge and then you read that ruling, right? You're like, well, this is a bit much. Got a whole kind of naming a state as Christian and implying a certain notion of natural law connected to a biblical literalism that doesn't really hold up if you read the Bible. But nonetheless, that was awkward. And then if you hear the guy go like, oh, no, this is what I believe and why I'm doing it.
Right.
Right. Like it's a theological justification for using mechanisms of power in the political, economic, and legal sphere to where the means are justified by the ends, and the ends are determined by this ideological vision that doesn't recognize the diversity and complexity of our multi-religious, multi-ethnic democracy. It
Right.
actually sees that as something problematic to America being what God called us and chose us to be. And it's really hard to reason with someone when and ask them to participate in normal democratic means if
Mhm.
the mandate you're acting out of is one that kind of legitimates using your power against the internal integrity of the democracy itself.
Yeah, and I think, Jillian puts up a really important clarification in the questions, and I think it's worth underscoring. You and I are theologians, and we're not lawyers. Technically, the case was a civil case, and so it did not have like a jury. It was a civil case where a judge issued a ruling about some plaintiffs had come and said, that their embryos had been destroyed, and so you can go and you can look at the actual case. So it was a civil case. So technically, IVF was not ruled illegal because you can't do that with a civil case. It wasn't a case about a law. In other words, it was a case about an accident that happened in an IVF clinic, as if I know all the details of what happened. And so the judge came out with this ruling, and this is this very theocratic ruling that, for all intents and purposes, created kind of a setting in Alabama where IVF is not technically illegal, but you can't practice it without the threat of these major lawsuits, and that because of what might happen to the products of conception, the embryos, the babies, that the judge said. And so there's just these huge, all of a sudden, liability issues facing the doctors, the clinics, the people who are in the labs, all of these, the people who store embryos for later and eggs for later use, all of that stuff. And so it was a way of ending IVF without actually passing a law. Um, and so that's what's happened now in Alabama. And it's the same strategy that was employed in the run up to the reversal of Roe versus Wade, where in many of these same states, sometimes they passed laws, but other times they didn't. They just sort of came up with policies Oh, well, you can't have a clinic where abortions are committed where the hallways are any less than 8 feet wide, because you have to be able to put 2 stretchers and 4 ambulance workers and across the same hall in order to ensure the safety of the women. So you come up with all these sort of complex liability issues, and you sort of put those into policies and practices. And what it was already doing before the end of Roe versus Wade was functionally shutting down access to abortion in many states across the country. And so, people were pulling out. Skilled doctors were pulling out. Um, Big hospitals were saying, well, we can't really do this because we might get sued. And so that's exactly the same direction that they're now taking IVF. But this was pretty draconian in Alabama. I actually have a friend who has a relative, who's a much younger woman, who was scheduled for an IVF implantation, I guess. I don't know what the actual word is or anything like that, in just a week. And now, and they've spent thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars getting to this point. And now she has no idea what's going to happen. And also, what's going on with the embryos, nobody knows anything. And so there's all kinds of issues that are occurring down there. But for us, it's really important to pay attention to this because it raises this really significant, ethical issue. And what happened about, why it's not just a theoretical thing when people say life begins at conception. It's moving to become a legal thing. Because right now it might not be a law, but if you have these policies in place, sooner or later it will. And sooner or later you're going to have something happen to the magnitude of overturning Roe versus Wade about IVF. This is the same process, and this has all been worked out by these very conservative Christian legal groups. There's one in Arizona. I can't remember the name of it, something like the American Defense Fund or something. I have to go look it up. But it's located in Scottsdale, Arizona. I've been past the offices. It's not very far away from where I used to live when I was a kid. And they actually have this whole sort of legal strategy laid out for how you do this on a whole variety of issues. This will be also the same approach with the reversal of same-sex marriage and the rights of gay people. Is that, first of all, you introduce a couple of very provocative cases in order to be able to test this sort of fundamental theological ideas in the public sphere. You win those cases, you make people afraid of doing things like a same-sex blessing, or you make people afraid of making a wedding cake for gay people or what have you, because, other people, you might get sued. And then sooner or later, you escalate from the fear of liability to policy, and then you escalate beyond that to actual law and the reversal of constitutional rights. That is the trajectory. And if anybody thinks that's not the trajectory, you aren't paying attention. And that's why, people say all the time, "Oh, Diana, you called this one." I did not call it. You can watch it. There's just evidence that this is the process. And now we've seen it go to its full ending with the Roe versus Wade stuff. And it worked. It worked like a charm. It took a while, but now they know how to do it. So now you do it faster. And then, so IVF, that's why we're here. And I hate that. I mean, it makes me sound like I'm kind of some sort of conspiracy theorist, nut, paranoid person who hates evangelicals. None of that is true. There are very bad people who are manipulating the story of Jesus and American history for very, very twisted reasons. And they've been working towards these ends for a long time in evangelical churches across the United States. And those of us who tried to call them on it years ago found ourselves, demeaned, kicked out, punished in every way possible. And they're still doing that kind of thing. But now they care less because they have more power. And so, it's just, And Mike Johnson is one of them. He's the Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Yeah.
And notice how they, when they get caught, this is always the funny thing. That's when they get caught, So, with the IVF thing, they said nothing. For the first 3, 4, 5 days, there was silence, just utter silence from the conservative evangelical politician community. And so someone was polling, and then and then the polls came back. Oh my gosh. They just like freaked out. And so now it's like, oh no, I support IVF. No, they don't. They support keeping their seats. That's what they support. And then what they're going to do is they're going to figure out some way to sort of adjust the strategy just a little so it's just slightly less offensive, and they can sneak it through with nobody noticing. So anyway, they don't they don't yes. And the other problem with IVF is not only does it throw embryos, this disposes of embryos that aren't used. Potentially, it allows gay people to have babies. And nobody talks about that. I mean, very few people have put that into this mix. Is that one of the things that's probably most offensive to white uh, Christian nationalists is the idea of gay people having children. And IVF allows them to do so with a surrogate. And oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. There is, you can't tell me that that's not one of the driving motivations to getting rid of IVF.
I'm going to guess that might play a role. It might play a role.
Tripp, you need to finish this up with, you want to talk about, Jon Stewart. I'm really interested in you talking about Jon Stewart. Why is Jon Stewart important?
Well, one thing I'll just say before we talk about Jon Stewart is people should come hang out with us at Theology Beer Camp, Diana. I haven't told anyone who's coming yet, but since, this is our members and you're coming, and we're going to do ruining dinner thingy at Theology Beer Camp. So people should come hang out with us. And there's like 30 of the pre-sale tickets left. So if you're a Homebrewed member or a member of the substack for Diana at the Cottage, you should go get your ticket because it's going to be awesome. And a bunch of our other friends are going to be there, but that all gets announced in like the next couple of weeks. But I'm anticipating that in October, on the 17th, when we kick off beer camp and do ruining dinner, that there too will be topics for us to discuss a few weeks before the election. What is your guess?
Is Jon Stewart coming?
No, I meant what do you think we'll have new material?
Oh yeah,
for a podcast a few weeks before the election. See, I'm thinking if you enjoy coming to this, just think of how much you will need to be able to do it in an environment with over 500 people with shared values, with where the beverages are included in your ticket. You know what I mean? I'm just saying it might be the moment of solidarity people are looking for.
A few weeks before the election.
Yeah.
If nothing else, yeah. I mean, yes. And things that happen immediately before elections can actually change elections.
Yeah.
We saw that in 2016 is that James Comey essentially changed the course of the 2016 election in the very last 2 weeks. So, hey, maybe a bunch of progressives who aren't willing to succumb to despair can gather together in Denver and encourage one another to the point of going out and saying, hey, I mean, really, because, the other thing that was really interesting is not just James Comey, but Mike Pence made videos that were shown on the Sunday before the election in white evangelical churches. And those videos have disappeared actually from the internet, but I saw them originally. And I think that there's one place where you can find them in the Wayback Machine, but it would take me a little work to dig it up. But those videos were Mike Pence telling evangelicals why it was okay to vote for Donald Trump. And immediately after the election, there were some people who analyzed the effect of those videos, and apparently there was a significant number of evangelical votes that were hanging in the balance until that Sunday. And Mike Pence, on the final Sunday of the election, came out and gave them a permission slip. And that permission slip might have made a difference in some of the states that had very close margins. So even something that's kind of off the radar, like a Mike Pence video in a service in evangelical megachurch, everything matters right now, and giving into despair is the last thing we can afford.
Yeah. So here's why the Jon Stewart thing I find interesting.
Yeah, please. I'm dying to hear this.
Is well, numerically, if you're a Gen X or a millennial and not a Republican, if you're independent or Democrat or Democratic Socialist, the news person you're most likely to listen to is Jon Stewart. And
Who knew?
He set a record in his first 3 weeks back, which he's doing the Rachel Maddow approach, where you just show up on Mondays for your show, and then other people do it the others. But the just the topics he's picked and the framing and the response from like mainstream media and Democrats, I think is revelatory. If I was trying to explain to people older than me how people my age and younger think, he gets it. Even when I disagree with him, I always think to myself, there's critical mass of my peers that would yell amen while he's talking. Part of it is like he's funny and has great timing. He also has no problem harassing people he, will even be supportive of on other things. But the first 3 weeks back, first week, he did the whole like Biden and Trump are old and is this the best we can do thing, right? And if you watched it, it's very clear he's like, I'm going to vote for Biden, but really, why can't we do better? And was naming just the thoughts that go through a majority of people I know, my age and younger's head. Like, for real, this is what we're dealing with. And then to see the response, like MSNBC people are lambasting it as if he didn't like he was very clear, like one of them's horrible and the other one is just old and couldn't we do better? Like John Fetterman, the senator who got purchased by the Israeli lobby and changed his mind on all sorts of stuff, also went on saying, like, if you're going to act like Jon Stewart, you should just go wave a MAGA flag. Morning Joe, which, dear God, how that works. It's like the stuff of nightmares for Tripp. They did the same thing.
And I make you watch it.
Here's what I just don't get. I don't get how it's that complicated to like, okay, how if you just listen to someone's frustration, you're more likely to get somewhere. But I was jealous South Carolina even had a primary because North Carolina didn't get one. And then now, since then, when you have the kind of get-togethers in the city for Democrats, that's like most of what happens are the majority of the people in the room complaining that we didn't even get a primary in North Carolina to write ceasefire now or undecided or vote for anyone else, because the assumption that mainstream media should just tell us this is all reasonable, all well and good around his age, and these kinds of questions just seems odd. Like he didn't do the Super Bowl. I sent you the Axios report.
Oh, you're talking about Biden, not Jon Stewart.
The Super Bowl. Yeah. Biden didn't do the Super Bowl, which is like it would have been the Giants softball. They pre-recorded and edited, and but then I sent you the Axios report where when he's doing those fundraisers.
Yeah.
He does his opening off a teleprompter talk at a fundraiser. They make the press leave, and then he answers 2 or 3 questions that are pre-vetted, and he has note cards of his answers on it. And I'm just saying, I have worked with clergy that were this incompetent, and everyone knows. And then you have to cover it up because you have to keep the whole system running. And I just think you can see if people that aren't comfortable with Jon Stewart, he's the release valve for Gen X and below. Gen X and millennials grew up with him. He said he was giving a hard time about 9/11 and our Iraqi war stuff before anyone on the mainstream media was allowed to do it. And he has figured out how through humor to channel our questionable relationship to any of the parties, and then names like all the craziness. The second week he goes after Tucker's trip to Russia, but he framed it with, all these Democrats in mainstream media are giving me a hard time for mentioning Biden being old. So I guess I'm supposed to do propaganda since I'm back on TV. Let me learn how to do it. And then he makes fun of Tucker Carlson's
Oh,
interview, where he
which
goes
is
and
propaganda.
yeah, where he's like, Tucker Carlson's like, look how clean the streets are. He's like, are you surprised the authoritarian streets are clean? Like they kill people that are their opponents and jail them. Like, and he's like, look how much I spent on my groceries. And he's like, they average $2,000 a year. Of course you can buy a lot of groceries for $50. These kind of like very obvious things. But like that to me, that gets at the kind of feelings when people just get all worked up, like somehow we should control the narrative. I think it's because some people actually remember where everyone had the same conversation publicly about politics and liked it better. And like, if we could all get as many people to have the same controlled framing of news, then we don't get anxious. But I think he's like, well, that's not the case if you've seen the internet. And then last Monday or yesterday, he did he did Israel Palestine. And there it was like straightforward on very obvious things, like why do you leak stuff about being uncomfortable with what Israel's doing, but we're funding the whole stinking thing? Like at what point, how many bombs you have to give them for you to be uncomfortable? It's like if you keep handing your friend a bat and he beats him over the head and then tell him like, I think that was a bit rough, right? Like what's the breaking point? And there's just a general uncomfortability because of the election and people's fear around Trump to do any kind of like mainstream media criticism of Joe Biden around his age, about challenging like mainstream collapsing of options in the media and such. Like we had
Well,
two
one
U.S.
thing
soldiers
I right.
self mutilate, burn themselves, and all if you go through all the headlines on like New York Times, Washington Post, no one said why he was doing it. There were two American soldiers set themselves on fire to protest our continued support of Israel's whatever you want to call it, genocide, war crimes, or whatever. In like to even not even let the people setting themselves on fire own story get on there because it could be critical of Joe Biden. That
Well,
kind of
actually,
stuff
those
is
those those stories did show up in their fullness. I think
yeah,
that
but
with
all the
the
original ones didn't label why. That was
well,
the
I think there's a little unfairness about this, is that the the if you look at the New York Times, one is what was it? They had 55 stories in the week following the thing about Joe Biden's age that showed up in that um the Richard her uh, uh criticism of Biden that released him from any kind of indictment related to the documents. And then he said,
yeah.
something negative about Biden's age. And what one thing, and I'm not I wanted a younger candidate. I wish Biden would have stepped aside for this election. I understand kind of, what happens to people when they get in the presidency, and you know, it's a hard thing, I'm sure, to give up. But so anyway, there was a huge amount of mainstream media attention to and criticism of Biden's age in the biggest papers, and there was no hesitation on the part
Especially
of.
after Ezra Klein's piece.
Well, I did not read Ezra Klein's piece, but there was that was so prevalent that a lot of people like me were yelling like, "Oh my gosh, it's like Hillary's emails." And so I think, a lot of us are still sort of reacting because of that, the blowing up of one thing into some giant thing when it's like it's an issue, but right now, whatever it is, 55 stories across the mainstream media should not be what is happening. Is like there's other things to pay attention to here. So in that sense, the New York Times really, and the Post and the really, 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 truly went after Biden, almost to the point of overkill. And the other thing with the stories about the two soldiers, when those kinds of things happen, the New York Times and the Washington Post, I mean, this I will defend them here. They're not the internet. is that you can't put you can't, or you shouldn't, and sometimes they do, and that's wrong when they do it. You can't put the rumor on the front page of the New York Times. So what the New York Times is going to do is that they're going to try to verify the story through a whole bunch of different sources. And this I actually know because I've published stuff in the New York Times. A New York Times fact check takes at least several hours to sit through because I have done that. You have to go back and you have to prove everything that shows up in your freaking story by multiple sources and by source resources that are available to you, like encyclopedias or other news sources that are recognized and pre-approved by the New York Times. And so like if the New York Times runs a poll, the New York Times has already vetted something like 25 polling organizations all around the world, and they've vetted them over a series of years to see how they do their work, blah 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 blah. And they have these lists, and anything that's not one of those polls never shows up in the New York Times. So so there's this incredibly strict vetting process that they do sometimes mess up on, and they do sometimes violate, and when they do, they generally tell you about it. And so what I suspect happened was with the two soldiers is that there was no immediate way to verify what witnesses said they heard when these soldiers did this thing. And so they withheld that one piece, wrote the stories, and then like the next day it was verified because they got all of this stuff, all of their ducks in the line, and now you can go to the New York Times or the Post or turn on the news, and the whole story is there about both of those young men. And so that's just the way that the mainstream media works. So the first case, you have what I call the herd effect of the mainstream media, which is a problematic. A person introduced me to this years ago, taught at the University of South Carolina Journalism School. I said, why does the news all sound alike? And she said, well, there's a herd effect. Is that if one group reports on a story, everybody else rushes to that same story. And it just was the story of the week was Biden's age. And so the herd effect went into place. And that can what that does is it skews the news. And Cecile Holmes, who one of the best journalists in religion, great journalism professor, just died about 3 years ago now. Um, she was the person who first told me about this, and she hated it. And she said, she said it's one of the worst problems in the media right now. And very few people talk about the herd effect, but you see it every day. I mean, you see it just when you watch the news. And it really needs to be undone. Something needs to happen with the herd effect. But then the other thing is the good part of the media, and that is multiple fact checking. And when you hear a rumor, even a rumor that is probably true, you have to prove it. And you have to prove it through multiple sources. And you have to be able to prove it to an editorial board that is sitting there, if you're the writer of that story, questioning you in every way, shape, or form. And like I said, I've been through it. It shocked me when for an opinion piece, the New York Times made me do so much work. It took me like 4.5 hours to be able to put together the package that they demanded to prove that my opinion was grounded in reasonable sources. And so what sometimes we're seeing with the mainstream media and the way these stories are presented is related to that. It's related to these kinds of problems that the mainstream media just has, one for ill and one for good. And so most people just don't know that that's the way these things work. So I don't think the New York Times is trying to hide anything from you. The New York Times is trying to get the story right. And until they can get a story like that right, I mean, that's explosive.
Yeah,
That's an
well,
explosive story. And so
I mean,
you
one
want to
of
get it
them,
right.
the actual, I mean, until all the different social media platforms took down his video, I mean, he sat and explained the whole thing. It's on his Facebook and his YouTube and that kind of thing, and they went and took it down. I think that's one of those times where you're like, well, since since it was on his actual social media and it's definitely him, and then he's dead and was on fire, but you can't tell me why, even though I've already watched his actual video explaining it. I think that's one of those elements, and then it's still never been linked to, even though I can find it in large numbers of it's been reposted at this point on other platforms. I think those kind of um, well, a lot of times the institutional procedures get
Right.
judiciously used towards certain things. Don't we wish it had been judiciously used on certain other topics that got ran with and then create embarrassment or problem? But that the element for me is how the like if you
And just so you know that here in Washington, D.C., the story about the soldier outside the Israeli embassy was reported with that from the very first.
Mhm.
The day that it happened, within an hour, the local news stations in Washington, D.C. were reporting that. And so this is this I really do think this is part of the trickle up theory from those local sources to places like the Washington Post and the New York Times, where the Washington Post didn't report it that way the first day either, even though the local news here in DC
Mhm.
was. So that, but now they are. And so I think that there was some issue for those major newspapers with the way that the story arose through their ranks, that they really felt it was important to get it right. And I don't know why. I mean, I wasn't sitting in their editorial offices, but there was, maybe they did want to just get it right, and that they didn't want to make a mistake because they felt it was so important. And it's much easier for the local news, that stuff, to be forgotten. But you know it, I know it, and so it's like at this point that's irrelevant. What's the relevant piece is the other piece of information, and that is that this is happening rather like it did during the Vietnam War.
Yeah, and in the if you think of uh I mean, when I in 2001, the Republican led response to 9/11, Iraq and Afghanistan, um like if you ask Gen X and elder millennials, do you ever consider voting for Republicans? A lot of us specifically mention uh that time.
Mhm.
If uh I mean, I have, a 200 and some former youth that are all over the country from either churches in the South or in Los Angeles. If you judge the way they are responding to the president's um, dealing with the rights of Palestinians, continued funding and support for Israel, that it, it it is being experienced in a very similar way, where this is at this point a straightforward moral question, and I don't think the Democratic Party uh, gets that. And hopefully the number of people that ride in Michigan's big enough that Biden, at least for pragmatic reasons, has to do something different. But like I his slowness and perceived dullness of sorts over time has made me change my mind over on this, along with the way the American foreign policy played out in the Pakistani election. That just is one of those where we're we're essentially backing a military backed coup of the election, and saying that then the military is abducting candidates, turns off the internet, and won't even allow the predominant party to be registered. So you have to know the candidates' names individually, and then the party we weren't supporting wins election despite all that, and now we're having to send over new representatives and stuff because we were so vocally against the election, right? And so like when you see things like that, or like the way the rest of the world relates to Israel, Palestine, and we do it differently. It's hard to believe any political party in America is a steward of the international rules-based order, or that these kind of things anymore. That there used to be a lot more confidence, I think, in citizens that there were shared values in the way we relate to the rest of the world. At this point, it's hard to imagine like Biden or other parties, or or a Trump-led one, being invested where our values are shaping our foreign policy in ways that you would hope it would, and so people
Yeah.
feel stranded. And if you aren't even going to listen or let those questions be raised, it creates more of a problem when it goes to election time than if you hear them get awkward and possibly respond to them or not.
I really one of the takes that I've been really thinking through this because all of this is very disturbing to me, um, as it should be for anybody who's paying attention to the news. Um, you know, I realize that there's something very interesting going on with religion, and nobody else has really paid a moment's notice to it. Is that we talk about Biden's age, okay, and so one of the things is Biden grew up in a completely different cultural setting. I'm less worried about Biden using note cards because I find that I have to sometimes use note cards now. It's like the but Biden grew up in a whole different cultural age, and the way that we thought about religion in the middle to the end of the 20th century, and this would be true for the Greatest Generation, the Silence, and certainly a large number of baby boomers. And I kind of think I'm sort of at the crack of the end of the baby boom, and so I see things a little different than some of the older boomers. But what we were taught, I mean, we were literally taught in school and in church and in public speeches and in politics that America was a Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish nation. We were a tripartite religious country where Protestants and Catholics and Jews formed this sort of interreligious commitment to democracy, and that we could get along with one another, and that that was what inclusion meant, was Protestant, Catholic, Jew. And so when you come up to a moment, and also the other piece we were taught is that alliances and loyalty matter, is that you keep your promises to your allies. And so you don't question. I mean, we're taught not to question what England did, or we're taught not to question what NATO did, or and that changed somewhat, like I said, for younger boomers around things like South Africa and apartheid, and we and Vietnam, really, is that we questioned our own government, and we questioned also what was going on, in global affairs, and we pushed. But nevertheless, that was a very hard move for an entire generation of people to make, because we were told constantly that if you questioned your allies, it was essentially cooperation with the communists. And so that was the framework in which we existed, that the question was to cooperate with the enemy. And so you have these two things that are functioning, I think, for Joe Biden. One is the tripartite idea. You think you're being inclusive when you're talking about Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. And what happened, of course, is that functionally makes everybody else invisible. It makes secular people invisible. It makes Muslims invisible. It makes Buddhists invisible. It makes Hindus invisible, which, in the context numerically of the mid to late 20th century, up until like the 90s, it was easy to do because there just weren't literally. I knew no one who I knew no human being in person who wasn't one of those three things: Protestant, Catholic, or Jew. And it wasn't until I was 15 years old that I knew a Jew. And so to think that I'm 65 years old and that I'm not like dead And I didn't even know a Jew until I was 15 years old. And it was like foreign, they were like people from the Bible, and it was, it was, and so if that's the case for me, can you imagine the case for somebody who's 80? And so Biden functions inside. I mean, this is why I think these are actually the more important issues than whether or not he uses note cards. It's like, how much does Biden really understand based on his whole life experience that it isn't 1975? And that you can't, that America is so much more. But see, his first instinct was to cooperate with Israel. And I don't think it's because he wanted Netanyahu to commit a genocide. I mean, for God's sake, we're talking about Joe Biden here, Mr. Catholic. And so, it was years before he could say that he was in favor of abortion rights. You could say he was pro-choice because he was so deeply committed to the Catholic Church that he couldn't even, he was just choking out the fact that Democrats supported abortion.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's no way that Joe Biden wants Netanyahu to be murdering Palestinians in the streets. I mean, and there's no way that Joe Biden loves the fact that American bombs do all this all the time. I'm sure that Joe Biden would have the peaceable kingdom arrive tomorrow if he possibly could. So his first instinct, though, is very much a 20th century instinct. And that is, you support the Jews. Because we live in a country that's Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish, and the Jews are our friends. And we have to make up for all the nasty, horrible stuff that people did during the Holocaust to try to kill the Jews. And we didn't do enough about that. And so we're still living with the guilt of that. And so we have to take care of the Jews. And and that for him was the choice of inclusion. That was the big choice because that's how he grew up. And you support your allies. You're loyal to your friends, because if you're not loyal to your friends, you're supporting your enemies. You're a communist. Trump's going to win. You're supporting the bad guys. And so I think those two impulses just sort of took Biden into trusting Netanyahu and not thinking through it in certain ways, the political results of what you were saying, and that is living in a world that wasn't schooled in that kind of stuff. It's not a world that's Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish anymore. And I think that it just didn't occur to him that there was this large population of American Muslims and Palestinian people who came from Palestine or who had relatives in Palestine, Arab Americans of different sorts, Palestinian Americans, who would be opposed to this, who are normally part of his coalition. And I think that it came, and then of course, I think he was really done in. I think Netanyahu knifed him in the back. I think Netanyahu's played this like a fiddle. And so not that Biden has made every perfect move, but see, this is the problem of his age is not his memory or specific ways. He acts like your grandfather or your great grandfather. But it's really about what is the first cultural pattern he leans into when he's making decisions. And the cultural pattern, I mean, that was the first cultural pattern I leaned into.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he has a memory of the debate around whether JFK could be president, right? As
Correct.
a Catholic.
No, exactly. I mean, he lived that himself as a young man.
Well, I'd love for him to take Papa Francis's advice a little bit more on this one.
Well, I think that this we could debate, but neither one of us actually knows the answer to it. But it seems to me to be the case that I highly suspect they are taking Papa Francis's advice much more seriously behind the scenes than they can in public at this point.
Yeah, and
so
I
that's
think, I mean, if people, especially those that been at these before, I mean, there is a lot more sympathy for Biden's position, 200,000 Palestinians ago, and when we discussed it, right? So I think that there's both there's like the moral part of it, but the other part is that that episode, like yesterday's episode with Jon Stewart, I think, like raised to the fore is just, here's what goes to the mind if your framing narrative is I became an adult after 9/11,
Right.
right?
No, and
It-
that's really important.
yeah, it is. And it's just really, it's different. And yeah, there's the generational distinctions, but there's also just a different suspicion around power and politics, and where the assumption is like the blob on foreign policy in both parties is problematic when it goes to its relationship to the military industrial complex. Though, yeah, Biden also is the one that got up on Meet the Press and slipped out about gay marriage. So,
Right.
see, maybe that's why they don't want him doing interviews. He might just say like, "Oh, Netanyahu, horrible guy."
Oh, he
Leading
already
a
has.
yeah, like
He
like
called him an ass.
the just let it
Oh, no, he
loose.
called Putin an ass.
Yeah, just have him let it loose, and they're like, "Oh, Joe, well, that was that. That wasn't on your note card." No, it's just
Well,
free balling.
did you see what he did yesterday? He said that that the ceasefire will probably be called on Monday. And so, see, that's the kind of thing that
While
Biden
eating
does
ice cream,
while
which is
eating
like
ice cream.
the most old man move. Like, you got to admit, like, it was just like, let someone ask me a question while I'm eating this ice cream. That way, if I got to collect my thoughts. He just
See, this is why, I mean, this is why I haven't been able to come out and just sort of full on stand with all with people, are screaming genocide Joe and all this sort of stuff. Because honest to God, if Joe lets it slip, that kind of thing slip in public, we can't even begin to imagine those conversations. And so all you had to do was watch to see where Anthony Blinken's itinerary was taking him on a daily basis. I mean, they're talking to everybody. They're trying to form some sort of pan-Arab alliance, to control to make something happen here that will stop Iran. I'm sure that's a big part of it.
oh yeah.
That will stop Iran, that will keep oil flowing because that's just important to all of them. Sorry, Bill McKibben, I wish that wasn't the case, but there you have it. And that they want to control this situation so Gazans are stopped killing in the street, that they can get aid in there, and they can get rid of Netanyahu. They do not like Netanyahu. He is an unreliable ally because he's abused them. See, they're mad because he's abused their trust. They literally told him before he even dropped a bomb, "Don't be stupid." And they told him that in public. "Don't be stupid. Don't do the wrong thing." And yes, guns flow. That's because of those damn, this is the way this thing works. That's the part I hate. It's like I don't want to pay my taxes either because of it. But, what this alliances, political, global alliances are economic, and they're military. And this is exactly what Eisenhower warned us about back in the 1950s.
Yep. Oh yeah. One of the Morning Joe moments that triggers Tripp the most is when Joe and Mika like to point out all this military funding for Ukraine and Israel is also a jobs program in America, as if that should be a selling point.
I know.
And I think to myself,
terrible.
are you sure? Are you sure this is what we're going to sell it on? And plus, I could come up with a number of things we could spend that much money on that would be job programs that would increase our foreign policy. And I don't know, like wild things like feeding. There's that, education. What about a medical invasion complex? And we figure out how to export, I don't know, pediatrician healthcare into places of rural poverty and inner city areas where there's not quality healthcare in America. And then maybe we even export it all the way into other countries. It would be wild. What if we did it in all the countries where the immigrant invasion in scare quotes is coming from, and we do this weird thing like invest in their infrastructure, well-being, and children, and like maybe they have flourishing lives, and in order to feed their kids, they don't have to do risky journeys, and that whole thing would be wild. Right.
I would just like them to do the risky journey of paying off your student loans.
Well, That's dangerous. That's dangerous. Yeah, that'd be. I've thought about sending that email. John, I'm really frustrated about this. So don't worry. I guess I'll still vote for you, but I'd be enthusiastic about it. You handled the student
I
loans.
keep hoping
Like
it.
you
I
either
keep
need
hoping.
you either have to address like military industrial complex. I know that might be a bit much.
Right.
So the fallback, it's just my student loans. Just do that.
Just 2 trips.
I'll get a tattoo of you. Just get it on there.
Well, so anyway, I think this is interesting. I mean, this is a hard discussion to have cross generations. Nobody wants to have this discussion, really. And I really have listened. I mean, really listened. My daughter would probably tell me I hadn't listened, uh, because I've really worried about the way that this was being framed. In some cases, the whole thing about Genocide Joe, I'm convinced that that's actually a Russian disinformation campaign. But I can't prove that. That's not going to be on the front page of the New York Times because there's no facts behind that. That's just Diana's rumor. And so,
But if they get that time Nancy Pelosi said it about people protesting in front of her house, they could put her quote saying that half the protesters in front of her house were funded by Russians in the picture. That's like the sneaky workaround. And I always think to myself, like every time Republicans say stuff about Nancy Pelosi being on the liberal agenda, I'm like, you really don't know any of them. I got friends that she's their congresswoman and they are at her house protesting, and it is not because
not Russians.
It is not because they're worried that she's gone too far left.
So anyway, but I've been worried about the. I mean, it makes the thing that the young man did makes me really sad, because what I'm convinced that I do know about the way that this sad, horrible thing that we're saddled with of the military industrial complex works, and I do protest that, and I think that churches have a lot of space there to make a lot of ethical and, moral noise about this, and should have been making more over the last 5 decades. But the thing with the young man, what I think we can be confident of is that there has been a steady push towards ceasefire and the end of this war in the mechanisms of government that aren't showing. And that is one thing I do know from living here for almost 25 years now, is that the things that are the most important you never hear about until they happen in Washington, D.C. There'll be little inklings of them here and there, but the silence that is built up around whatever's been happening behind the scenes dealing with Israel and Gaza has been deafening. And so that silence then creates this political vacuum. And then all kinds of stuff fills in the political vacuum that will later be shown to be complete garbage. And so what's happening, I really do think, is that there's been just this enormous amount of behind the scenes work, and and I hope that what Biden let leak is true, that we're nearing the reveal, that something is actually going to happen that's going to be quite startling and hopefully healing for the whole of the Middle East. We won't know it till it happens, because this is the way that these things are. And so I feel like those 2 young men, they gave they gave into just an enormous level of despair. And yeah, they made I think, especially, if a ceasefire is announced as early as next week, they killed themselves basically for nothing. Because all of this is already completely underway and has been for weeks and weeks and weeks, if not months. And it just is that the way the world sadly works is that nobody's been able to say it until it happens. And so that makes me sad about those guys.
Yeah.
I don't want to see anybody to kill anyone, and I don't want to see anyone kill themselves. and I don't want to see people give up. And you certainly shouldn't give up your right to democratically protest. I mean, that's just part of it. That's the political space gets filled in by voices of people expressing their opinions, and that's the way it should be. But at the same time, there's also this other piece that's probably moving in the way that things move in Washington, slow, steady, silently, toward what we hope will be a more decent and more moral resolution than the current situation presents. So, and it won't be perfectly moral, and it won't be perfectly decent. This is
Well,
Diana's
it will be perfectly human. So
this
there's certain
Diana's
limits.
Nieborianism coming out. This is, I agree with like Karl Barth and Reinhold Niebuhr at these places where politics is messy, horrifyingly human, polluted business. But there it is.
Mhm.
You do better than you can than the best choice in politics is just it's always just what's the better choice. There's no ever great choice.
Well, your husband pointed out in the chat that Nikki Haley's church disaffiliated with the United Methodists.
Oh, so they are
So
fundamentalist, or they are more evangelical types.
all you UMC listeners can feel a little bit better right now.
When we've been just talking and talking today, I can't believe we've gone so long.
Look, I thought I did wrap up moment twice, thinking out we were getting the end, and you just wanted more. Which some of us here perfectly capable 2-hour podcast on a regular basis. It's just that's what I have to do. I have to time random things that will get you energized again, and it's just like, and then Diana's going to go more. But if y'all want to have some fun with Diana and I, when we
this is really the wrap up.
Yeah, then you can go to theologybeer.camp. That's what I'm talking about. It's going to be fun. And I think there's like 30 tickets left in the pre-sale things. And we start announcing stuff, some of which will include the fact that Diana is going to be there. And I didn't even tell you one of our other friends that's coming. Let's see. Very spunky nun. And
okay, you have to tell us who.
It was a hint,
Joe Chittister.
No, also into science and religion, and has done podcasts with us before.
Elia.
Yeah.
Delio.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, you got Joan Chittister to go?
No, because I was sitting there and when we were talking, she sent a message and was like, well, what about this Theology Beer Camp thing? And I was like, you want to come, Diana? Like I had quite a bit of fun when the three of us did something together last time. That was quite the entertaining
we had
episode.
a great time.
Also had requests for us to do something like the Christology ladder again, where you harass Phil and I as we lay out a multiplicity of options in theological scene and force us to explain and all that kind of stuff.
That was actually fun too.
I know it was. It's currently the most popular episode of the year.
No,
got
you're
lots
kidding.
of shares. I've gotten emails from people that professors assigned it in their theology class. They were like, "Oh, I've just gotten into your thing. My professor sent us this video of you and Phil and Diana, and it was so helpful because all the things Diana's asking is what everyone was trying to get our professor to answer, who's looking at us like, didn't y'all do the reading? It's immediately obvious." And
no wonder I got so many young readers all of a sudden.
They're just like, this is great. This explains. It's like, you'll actually explain the difference between these things. I didn't know what. Yes, we might do that. And yeah, it's gonna be fun. And we're gonna have a lot of cool music and such. And it's gonna be a lot of fun. If you go to theologybeer.camp, you can get a ticket before we announce everything, and then like costs and stuff go up. But yeah, like, we announced on Valentine's Day, and then already like there's over 100 people that already got tickets. So I was like,
wow.
And the only thing on there's like a picture of my head cropped into a picture of Aragorn from Lord of the Rings,
I
because
love that picture. I think it's hilarious.
last time was like the God Pod Strike Back, using like Empire Strikes Back, the sequel, and then Return of the King is the third movie in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So we were like, oh, this would be fun. Yeah. Oh, Deborah, yes. If you just go to the Homebrewed Christianity podcast, just look for Christology Ladder. It'll be a picture of me and Diana and Phil Clayton. It was a fun one.
It was a fun one. And honestly, I was not playing the sort of, straight woman in the sense of, letting you guys just be brilliant. I had real questions.
Oh
when
no.
you, when you were talking, I was just asking. You told me to ask them, so I
Oh
did.
yeah. Well, because it's you don't you never know what the common things are that you don't even need to state anymore. And when it's someone that before you met them, you read all of his books, and then he supervised your dissertation, and then you've taught together, and then you have an ongoing conversation since you were like 22.
Yeah, it's a little hard.
The volume of things that Phil and I have in our, like, we're not discussing this again, this is obviously a shared thing or a parting point. They just kind of exist, and you never know when you have to explain things. And yeah, so
We,
it's
well,
fun.
I just want to tell you that again, as we end, I just really appreciate it today. I love talking to you. Oftentimes when I'm in discussions with people who are my age and older, I say, I got this friend, Tripp Fuller, and he keeps me honest intergenerationally. And so you do, it's helpful to me. I think I understand more of the world from being able to have these discussions with you. And I hope in some ways it works the other direction too. Just it's sometimes harder to hear things from your parents. Mom and dad might be here today. Hi, mom and dad.
Oh, well, my dad, I talked to him this morning, and he's like, oh, your mom's so excited for ruining dinner later. She loves Diana, loves her. And he's like, she's like, your mom gets excited when she gets to watch you and Diana talk. And I'm like, I mean, I like it too. And I
Oh,
was like, well, she
thanks.
still likes me too, right, Dad? And she's like, oh, that's fine, but
I hope that I stand up okay for open-minded old folks.
oh
You
well.
know, is to explain kind of the stupidity that we do sometimes. Um, because I really the whole thing with Biden and the Protestant Catholic Jew, I think that explains so much, and nobody really ever talks about stuff like that.
Mhm.
But, it doesn't give him a pass, but what it does is it says the important thing. It says, you because we were born so far apart, there are different cultures that shaped our childhoods. And that's, I think, part of the joy of doing Ruining Dinner is that fr I get to hear that from you in ways that is meaningful and very fresh to me. And I hear it from my daughter as well, but she's, again, almost 20 years younger than you. So I
Yeah.
got these 2 voices all the time in my brain. It's like, "Oh, Tripp and Emma, Tripp and Emma," you know?
Well, we should just get her to join once. Then get be like, Emma, don't you want to come ruin dinner?
Oh my gosh, that would be so fun to have a Gen Zer come along.
Yeah, it'd be uh the whatever, like, generational dinner explosion of sorts.
Oh my
So
gosh, I had lunch with a friend of mine who's my age, and we've been friends since we were 13, and her daughter, who's actually younger than my daughter. And, so I got just such a we had Teresa, my friend Teresa, she left, and it was just me and her daughter talking about all these things, and we were actually talking about Gaza and Biden and the whole thing, and, I got the feeling that her mom wasn't quite the generous conversation partner that I was being with her. Because when we're with our parents or our own kids, sometimes that doesn't quite work, but we wound up having this wonderful, amazing conversation, and that's what I really hope, in these, if there's any hope for the Mainline to go back to where we started. And if you really do want the young people to come to church, never say that, for one thing. But the second thing is, it's about creating generous conversation space and really learning to listen and respect and treat with dignity the experience of multiple generations in community, and relating all of that to Jesus and the Jesus story. So that's kind of where I just love being with you, Tripp, because we do that. I hope.
I love Jesus.
I hope we do that
Support.
together. I know we both
I like
love
hanging out with you too.
Jesus.
But we'll do it again next time on Ruining Dinner, and we're we're considering doing it more frequently during the election year.
So we don't have to do it for 2 hours.
Yeah. So feel free to encourage us or talk us down, but I'm not against. Plus, Lisa and I know my mom's gonna watch. So
yeah, the other thing is maybe we can divide it in half, part 1 and part 2, and send it out that way.
All right.
All right. Hey, great day.